The iconic red and blue logo of the PepsiCo brand can be found everywhere, from Tokyo to Alaska, and everywhere in between. The beverage juggernaut is easily recognized for its flagship can of fizzy pop, but its massive empire stretches far beyond a simple soda. On the beverage front, PepsiCo also distributes Mountain Dew, Gatorade, Lipton, and Aquafina. The list is almost endless, but beverages are just the tip of the iceberg for everything they control. Under PepsiCo's umbrella are brands like Lay's, Fritos, Ruffles, Cheetos, Doritos, Sun Chips, and Tostitos. Even massive fast food giants like KFC, Taco Bell, and Pizza Hut are all under the influence of this soda pop magnate. But notoriety on this scale and the rise to their modern dominance did not come without a little bit of troublemaking in the process. Honestly, the story of Pepsi is frankly unbelievable, loaded with cold, calculated corporate ambition, impropriety, exploitation, and aggressive practices. Pepsi even negotiated for a fleet of naval warships as payment from Russia, only after vodka wasn't paying off. But can you really expect anything less coming from a company that started as a Coca-Cola ripoff? So how did it all happen? How did Pepsi rise from bankruptcy to a $200 billion global powerhouse? This is the extraordinary story of Pepsi, a tale that traces its roots back to a man named Caleb Bradham, born in 1867. Caleb grew up in a small farming community in North Carolina. Despite his father being a merchant, the family was affluent enough to provide Caleb an education opportunity. He pursued medical studies at University of North Carolina, but when financial difficulties struck the country, his family was not immune, and Caleb left school. Returning to his hometown, he worked as a teacher and began to offer medical advice to locals, earning their respect as if he were a real doctor, though he never finished medical school. Within 2 years, Caleb saved enough money to return to school, though this time he chose to study pharmacy instead of medicine. In 1892, at the age of 25, Caleb opened Bradham Pharmacy in New Bern, North Carolina. Pharmacies in those days served as community hubs, often featuring soda fountains, where customers could enjoy carbonated drinks mixed with flavored syrups. Caleb, known for his sociable nature, quickly became a beloved figure in the town. That same year, Coca-Cola was founded in Atlanta, Georgia, and its cola syrup became a favorite at soda counters. Inspired by Coke's success, but critical of its use of addictive ingredients, Caleb set out to create his own cola syrup, one he believed would promote health. Combining caramel, fruit extracts, and essential oils, he crafted a beverage initially dubbed Brad's Drink by locals. After 5 years of growing popularity in his pharmacy, Caleb rebranded his creation as Pepsi Cola in 1898, drawing on the Greek word Pepsis, meaning digestion, to emphasize its supposed health benefits. Pepsi Cola's popularity grew steadily, with Caleb producing the syrup in his pharmacy and distributing it to other soda fountains. By 1903, he had officially established the Pepsi Cola Company, closing his pharmacy to focus entirely on his beverage. Early marketing efforts, such as newspaper ads, boosted sales significantly, leading to rapid expansion. By 1910, Pepsi was being bottled and distributed across 24 states. However, the outbreak of World War I brought disaster. Sugar prices skyrocketed due to rationing, and Caleb made a costly gamble by stockpiling sugar, expecting prices to rise further. Instead, prices plummeted, leaving him with unsellable inventory and mounting debts. By 1920, Pepsi Cola filed for bankruptcy, and Caleb, at 53, sold the company's assets and returned to pharmacy work. In 1934, he died, never witnessing the brand's upcoming resurgence. After changing ownership multiple times and enduring a second bankruptcy during the Great Depression, Pepsi found a lifeline when it was acquired by the Loft Candy Company in 1931. Innovative cost-cutting measures, such as using recycled bottles and selling larger portions at competitive prices, helped Pepsi appeal to budget-conscious consumers. The introduction of catchy advertising jingles and strategic marketing campaigns further bolstered its recovery. Pepsi's story took another turn during World War II, when it embraced patriotic branding and outreach initiatives, such as recording booths for soldiers to send messages home. These efforts endeared the brand to the American public. Later, Pepsi broke ground by targeting underserved markets, including the African American community, with inclusive advertising campaigns. In the post-war era, visionary leaders like Alfred Steele and Don Kendall propelled Pepsi to new heights. Steele revamped Pepsi's image with glamorous advertising and product redesigns, while Kendall orchestrated Pepsi's entry into the Soviet Union during the Cold War, using creative barter deals to navigate currency restrictions. This bold strategy made Pepsi the first American brand available in the USSR. In 1950, Pepsi made a bold move by appointing Alfred Steele as its new CEO. He was the former vice president of Coca-Cola, and he brought insider knowledge of the cola industry and quickly set about transforming Pepsi's entire operation. He prioritized advertising campaigns and promotional strategies, incorporating glamorous imagery and celebrity endorsements. Among his innovations was enlisting his wife, Hollywood icon Joan Crawford, as the face of Pepsi, leveraging her star power to captivate consumers and drive sales. Steele completely rebranded Pepsi, right down to its sleek new logo and a stylish swirl bottle design. From this point, Pepsi was no longer seen as a budget alternative. Behind the scenes, Steele empowered the employees and rewarded innovation and efficiency. His efforts paid off handsomely, with Pepsi's annual sales skyrocketing from $1.6 million in 1950 to $11.5 million only 8 years later. His tenure, though transformative, was tragically cut short when he passed away from a heart attack in 1959. Leadership then passed the CEO torch to Don Kendall, a Pepsi veteran who had climbed the ranks from syrup salesman. Kendall's vision extended beyond the US, and he made the decision to introduce Pepsi to the Soviet Union during the Cold War in 1959. At this time, President Dwight Eisenhower organized the American National Exhibition in Moscow to showcase American culture. Kendall seized the moment, famously offering Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev his very first taste of Pepsi. The exhibition paved the way for Pepsi to strike a deal with the USSR, making it the first American brand sold in the Soviet Union. But there was a catch. The Soviet ruble was essentially worthless outside the USSR, so they came up with their own payment system, a barter system, exchanging Pepsi Cola concentrate for Stolichnaya vodka, which Pepsi then sold in the US for profit. This arrangement lasted until the late 1970s, when vodka sales declined sharply and forced Pepsi to seek alternative compensation from Russia. The most infamous proposal involved the Soviet government offering Pepsi a fleet of decommissioned military vessels, where 17 submarines, a cruiser, frigate, and a destroyer served as payment to Pepsi. For a moment in history, Pepsi almost became the 6th largest navy in the world, but in the end, Pepsi opted for a different deal. They instead commissioned Soviet-built commercial ships. Ironically, these plans unraveled with the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. Over the years, Pepsi acquired major Russian brands, making it one of the region's top food and beverage manufacturers. This dominance persisted until 2022, when tensions following Russia's invasion of Ukraine prompted Pepsi to cease operations in the country, ending its decades-long relationship with the Russian market. It is not unusual for companies to run marketing campaigns, but doing so in an economically challenged society like the Philippines once led to the revolt of an entire country. In 1992, Pepsi launched a promotional campaign that offered the equivalent of $40,000 to anyone who found the winning number on the underside of their bottle cap. This led to sales of Pepsi products skyrocketing. After all, that amount of money would be enough to pull any Filipino family out of poverty. The odds of winning were intended to be astronomical, of course. Every evening the news would reveal the winning number. Only 2 bottle caps with the number were supposed to be printed. One day the winning number was called. But there was one very big problem. Pepsi decided to extend the campaign for 5 weeks, mostly so Pepsi could extend the promotion, driving sales and revenue. But something went horribly wrong. A computer glitch caused 600,000 bottle caps to have the winning number printed on them. Many Filipino customers spent money on Pepsi products they could hardly afford, all for a chance at that promised life-changing $40,000. The winning number ended up being so common that some people had more than one. When thousands of ecstatic winners showed up to claim their prize, PepsiCo refused to pony up, clutching to the printing error as their excuse. The struggling population did not take this betrayal of hope lightly, turning this marketing error into serious social unrest. They had little to invest, and this multinational corporation teased them, only to snatch the prize away. The country erupted in protests, destroying property, hundreds of injuries, and 5 deaths. Who could blame them? This should have been an eye-opening experience for PepsiCo. Their corporate decisions were not just a PR nuisance, but bore very real, tragic consequences against real people. Paying out the full sum to all the winners would have cost Pepsi over $24 billion. To avoid this, they instead only paid a tiny fraction of the grand prize to the winners. They each received about $20. Even to this day in the Philippines, if someone says to you, "You got $3.49, well, that means you got tricked. The Pepsi number fever claimed the lives of 5 people and left 12 with injuries. If you're wondering how 5 people died in a protest about Pepsi soda, well, 3 Pepsi employees were killed by a grenade thrown into the warehouse, and a teacher and a 5-year-old both died when a Pepsi truck exploded from a homemade bomb. News headlines tried to say that Pepsi bombed their own trucks, but as it turns out, they needed to paint the local coalition of local winners as terrorists. Pepsi supposedly paid people to infiltrate Coalition 349 and spurt on the riots. All court cases were tossed out, and Pepsi was deemed not negligent. Pepsi only got a slap on the wrist. They only had to pay a fee of about $5,500, or the equivalent of 150,000 pesos at that time. On the environmental front, Pepsi and Coca-Cola have an enormous ecological footprint. PepsiCo's plastic production is overshadowed only by Coca-Cola. Pepsi is responsible for 2.5 billion tons of plastic waste every year. The waste is enough to fill 4 square miles, or roughly the size of a massive parking lot for up to 300 million cars. The effects are so serious that the Attorney General of New York filed a lawsuit against PepsiCo in 2023. PepsiCo, in turn, promised several initiatives that were in line with their corporate playbook. Their strategy: delay, distract, derail. Delay tactics often begin with promises of voluntary reforms designed to persuade governments that strict regulation isn't necessary. These efforts are backed by intense lobbying to stall legislative progress, and at times involve withholding or distorting critical data to downplay the severity of the issue at hand. Meanwhile, distraction techniques are used to shift focus and responsibility. These include promoting so-called solutions like chemical recycling or products made from ocean plastic, which often fail to address the root problem. Industries also deflect blame onto consumers, fund biased studies to reinforce their narrative, and co-opt environmental organisations to serve as public advocates for their interests. When legislation does gain traction, this is when derailment tactics come into play. These can involve legal challenges to question the validity of proposed actions, preemptive campaigns to prevent bans on single-use items, and aggressive lobbying, both overt and covert, to dilute or block meaningful reforms. Environmental activists, experts, and agencies have accused Pepsi of these greenwashing practices, saying that their intentions to correct any of their problems were never actually genuine. Simply put, PepsiCo's main focus was on positive public relations, keeping the peace but never really doing anything to solve the problems they create. In November 2024, the New York State Supreme Court dismissed the lawsuit. Pepsi managed to paint the consumer as the offenders causing the pollution. The manufacturer denied liability for consumers' improper disposal of plastic products, citing that it would contradict established legal principles. While their impact on the environment is one of convenient neglect, PepsiCo's history of labour practices in factories and bottling facilities is an outright affront to the cheerful, positive, and unifying image of their brand. The workers in these plants are the invisible spine of Pepsi's success, yet the conditions they face are things that, if the consumer knew about, would likely never buy from Pepsi ever again, or at least make them think twice about it. PepsiCo has bottling plants in multiple Asian and Latin American countries, where the company has faced some massive exploitation allegations. These were not isolated problems either. They made it a pattern. The working conditions were repeatedly reported as unsafe, putting the health and lives of employees at risk to capitalise and maximise profits. Workers spoke up about being forced to handle caustic cleaning chemicals with no protective gear and maintaining high-pressure bottling equipment without any training. Many developed respiratory issues from exposure to fumes and carbonation gases, while others suffered severe burns from chemical spills and injuries from malfunctioning machinery. To keep its costs down, Pepsi frequently postponed equipment maintenance to stretch their dollar while their machines deteriorated and the likelihood of a malfunction and injury increased day by day. Wages for this risky work barely afforded workers basic survival, never mind access to adequate healthcare. Any efforts to organise for rights and protection were swiftly squashed by Pepsi. Organisations that track such violations issued evidence of workers being paid severely below the minimal standards needed for survival. To put this into perspective, the minimum wage in Malaysia then was about $271 per month, and Pepsi workers only made about $2 to $5 per day, which means that if an employee worked every day of the month, they would be pulling only about half the expected minimum wage. On top of that, they had their livelihood stripped by deceptive contract practices, like providing workers contracts in their native language. Then Pepsi would turn around and have them sign ones that had been rewritten in Mandarin or English, where Pepsi would then drastically change the terms, and the workers had no idea what they were agreeing to. Complaints were inevitably filed, but Pepsi either ignored them or punished the people by firing them or physical intimidation. Union leaders in Guatemala reported that Pepsi was intimidating employees from organising in advocacy for their rights. The plant had 1,300 workers. 360 managed to unionise. 28 were fired immediately without notice. Then, Pepsi hired 75 new workers to replace them so the union couldn't force a work stoppage. When they tried to form unions, Pepsi retaliated with threats. Cameras were installed around the plant. Armed guards escorted certain workers to collect personal things from their lockers and then coerced them into signing pre-made letters of resignation. Late-night calls filled with threats of consequences for organising, vehicle vandalisation, intimidation tactics like having unmarked vehicles follow workers home, and even death threats were reported. Pepsi even went to the spouses of these employees to convince them to take the severance deal. Even if the employee was just going to lose their job, they were told that they would be blacklisted from being hired by any other regional employers. Workers across multiple locations tried to force Pepsi to change, but the results were not ideal for anyone involved. In September 2020, Pepsi shut down one of its plants in Kanjikode, India, because of worker uprisings that started at the end of 2019 by workers in central Indian trade unions. Workers simply wanted adequate pay and safe working conditions. In March 2020, things escalated with threats of criminal actions that would lead to operational losses. So Pepsi took matters into their own hands and declared the plant inactive until September, when they decided to completely shut down the plant. This affected the lives of around 700 workers, turning their lives upside down. Like other companies that have done this, PepsiCo took advantage of economic disparities, helping to lower the costs of production at the expense of basic worker rights, which are minimised and treated like privileges. It gets even worse. PepsiCo took things up a notch in Southeast Asia. Pepsi is one of the world's leaders in palm oil purchases, relying massively on its distributors to deliver its own products. Over 450,000 tonnes are needed every year, with around 85% of that coming exclusively from Malaysia and Indonesia. Indo Foods plantation workers are forced to work 12-hour shifts in factories where the temperatures regularly exceed 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Workers regularly fall out from heat exhaustion and severe dehydration. Medical treatment is often delayed or even flat out denied altogether. Since the 1960s, their lands have been destroyed to serve as palm oil plantations equal to the size of California and New York combined. Over 3.5 million people are practically slaves to Pepsi. Strict bathroom break policies are imposed, with only 2 5-minute breaks per shift and only 1 15-minute break for water. In addition, many families still work full-time hours under inhumane conditions and still live in poverty. Pepsi is downright evil, so evil that they turn a blind eye to forced labour practices and even child labour, with children as young as 12 years old documented working alongside adults. The job requires workers to scale 60-foot-tall palm trees without protective equipment or harnesses. Others use highly toxic pesticides without respirators or gear to protect their skin and clothes. Naturally, their evil practices drew attention to their past commitments to responsible supply sourcing. In 2018, an investigation found that employees in Malaysia and Indonesia were subjected to tactics like physical abuse and even withheld wages for failing to meet excessively set quotas. Women were often harassed and assaulted by their male supervisors, leaving them no one to turn to with complaints of impropriety. Yet again, PepsiCo's practices sparked public outcry and calls for PepsiCo to come down on suppliers who engaged in such behaviour. Once again, Pepsi returned to its corporate playbook, where delay, distract and derail are their go-to strategies. They simply asked their suppliers to stop buying from these producers, yet continued to hold their suppliers to strict budgets. PepsiCo pledged to work with better companies and promote more ethical practices. Still, PepsiCo has a bottom line to protect. They never took responsibility for allowing this to go on in the first place and neglected human rights violations up until the day they were forced to address them. Even when Pepsi did finally take action, it was geared toward the prevention of future instances, and in no way did they own up to their mistakes, nor did they compensate their victims. The concern over the health effects of soda and other similar products in the food industry is well established, but in PepsiCo's case, the company has contributed to the concerns about a corporation's profit motives being detrimental to public well-being. This is ironic since Pepsi's rise was due to it being the healthier alternative to Coca-Cola, as it was originally made with saccharin and slightly lower caffeine content, and was even recommended as a digestive aid when being sold at pharmacies. PepsiCo's approach to concerns and accusations of health detriments caused them to change their approach, in marketing that is. Mountain Dew is a great example. Its reputation and vibrant green acid colour made it a cultural phenomenon, with wild urban legends popping up about it, including everything from dissolving tooth enamel to altering the biology of the human body. But those were mostly just rumours. The sugar content, however, was anything but. As diabetes and obesity rates reach new records, PepsiCo's products come under more scrutiny. A single can has 40 grams of sugar, while the American Heart Association says 36 grams of sugar per day for men and 25 for women is the limit. But be honest, have you ever had more than one soda in a day? A family filed a lawsuit in 2012, claiming that a dead rodent was found in their Mountain Dew. PepsiCo's ironic defense noted that the citric acid content in the drink would have jellified the rodent, admitting inadvertently to the drink's highly corrosive attributes. PepsiCo recognized the concerns and began to produce lower-calorie products and create alternate diet versions of their existing ones. But the chemicals used to produce the taste of these substitutes turned out to be more hazardous than the ones they aimed to replace. For example, the primarily artificial sweetener used in these substitutes is known to cause symptoms ranging from headaches to seizures. But PepsiCo's crack marketing team painted a sunnied-up version of the products as a front for demonstrating how health-aware they are for their customers. As I said, Pepsi became an alternative in the first part of the 20th century to Coke, which was at the time considered to be full of questionable elements. While Coke never really lost its market share to Pepsi, there have been times when the two are neck and neck. So close, in fact, that Coke tried to buy Pepsi on a few occasions. Pepsi refused a buyout 3 times and went on a mission to prove they were the drink of choice. The best Pepsi came up with was the Pepsi Challenge strategy, and it sparked a war. It was a blind taste test where the result was that people preferred Pepsi over Coca-Cola. Coca-Cola's CEO even took notice, saying what Pepsi did was not just a marketing gimmick. It's true. He said if you just look at the taste of the beverage, consumers ultimately did prefer Pepsi over Coke, which had a sweeter, more syrupy flavour. Coke tried to compete by revising their formula to be sweeter and calling it New Coke, but the people hated it. Backlash was so intense that 3 months later, Coke brought back the original recipe. Even though a new blind test revealed New Coke was the preferred soda, consumers didn't believe them. Pepsi had a short burst of massive success, stealing Coke's customers for a time. But eventually, people flocked back to Coca-Cola anyway. Multiple celebrities even came out to voice their opinions, but of course they were paid for it. The ads from the Coke wars were nothing short of spectacular. Oddly enough, Pepsi had the support of Michael Jackson and Bill Cosby, while Coke enlisted the magic of Santa Claus himself. Of course, at the time, they had no idea one would moonwalk his way into controversy. The other would be the punchline of many jokes. And one was a jolly old man who regularly sneaks into people's houses once a year. Then of course you had stars like Britney Spears, the Spice Girls, and even Van Halen appearing in Pepsi ads. Coca-Cola had Shaquille O'Neal, LeBron James, and even Taylor Swift in 2016. Mariah Carey managed to sign a deal with both companies. Ultimately, Pepsi never overtook Coke's market dominance, and despite their attempts at becoming the top cola brand in the world, Pepsi is still outsold by Coke and even Diet Coke globally. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Check out the wild stories of Chex or Kellogg next. You won't believe their seedy origin stories.